concept of covenant is one that's really important in the Bible, but many Christians don't really understand what covenant is all about. Hi there, I'm Lynn Fowler. I'm the leader of King of Glory Ministries International and pastor of Loch Christian Centre. In this teaching that I brought at Loch last weekend, I talk about the different kinds of covenant that are in the Bible and why the new covenant, the covenant that Jesus made at the cross, is so different from the others. I pray that you will be blessed by this message. If you are, please give us a like. Drop a comment and let us know what you think. And if you're a pastor or a leader in the church, or if you'd just like to know more about King of Glory Ministries International, there's a link in the description to our website where you can learn all about us and what we do and what we're about. So now, here's the message.
As you might guess from the readings, I want to talk about covenants. And there's basically three kinds of covenants in the Bible. The first one is the suzerainty treaty. Now, this was a covenant that was made between a king and his people, or between the king and the people of a foreign land that brought those people under his reign. It was initiated by the king, or sometimes if it was a foreign country, it could be initiated by the foreign country saying, we want to come under you, we want your protection, and so on. From the king's side, it meant, yes, that he would give them protection and provision, but it came with rules. Very often when it was dealing with other countries, it was about payments that had to be made, taxes that had to be paid to the king and his country. And then there was the laws that had to be obeyed. And that was a one-way treaty, as it was. It wasn't mutual in the sense that there was no equality between it. So the king was the one that made the rules. The people, whether it was his own country or another country, they didn't get to say, we're going to do this, that, or something else. They didn't get to say, we want you to do this, that, or something else. It was totally set out by the king. The second type also came from the king, but it was what was called a royal grant. And that was when the king said, I'm doing such and such. That's it. There was no obligation on the part of the people he was speaking to. There was no requirements. There was no question of this is going to change if you do such and such. It was simply, this is what I'm doing, and that's it. It stands. The third type was a blood covenant. Now, both of the other types are between a king and the people, so totally uneven. But a blood covenant was always between equals. And there was some very precise details to do with a blood covenant. So what they would do when they were entering into a blood covenant is they would take an animal or several animals, they'd split them in half and lay one half on this side, one half on that side. And the two parties who were entering into covenant would walk between those split animals. And the implication was, if either of us breaks this covenant, what is done to the animals will be done to us. So it was very, very serious. But most of all, a blood covenant was about coming into unity. It was two people becoming one. And the closest thing we have to it today is marriage, where two people become one unit. And as a result of that becoming one, there were several things that came about. The two parties would exchange clothing. And you can see this in where David and Jonathan made a covenant. And the first thing Jonathan does is take off his robe and gives it to David. And that's saying everything I have is yours. Everything you have is mine. We no longer have yours and mine, it's now ours. Likewise, every debt I have is yours, and every debt you have is mine. It's no longer yours and mine, it's ours. That unity. The second thing was an exchange of weapons, and with David and Jonathan, Jonathan gave David his sword and all his weapons, and that was symbolizing, I will defend you. No matter what the situation, I will defend you, and you will defend me. I will not fight against you in any situation, and you won't fight against me. And that's why in Genesis, where Lot and all the people of Sodom had been taken captive, and Abram comes and goes with his 400 and something odd men that were part of his household and goes to rescue them. It's not just because Lot was his nephew, it's because of a covenant relationship where he was bound, as it were, in that covenant relationship to go and defend Lot and chase Lot up. The third thing that would happen is that they would exchange names. So if Glennis and I were entering into a covenant relationship, I would become Lynn Stevens Fowler, and she would become Glennis Fowler Stevens. And we see that again in the marriage ceremony, perhaps not so much these days, because a lot of ladies these days don't take their husband's name, but traditionally the woman took the husband's name. There are some couples these days who do it more towards the covenant where the husband also takes part of the wife's name. So that's sort of a picture of the covenant relationship, of, again, that becoming one. So it's no longer you and me, it's we. As part of the covenant, there would normally be a covenant meal. And that was a time of setting the covenant in place and declaring it publicly. And we have just celebrated a covenant meal. And there would be some kind of symbol left behind to say this covenant has been established. So that blood covenant, as I say, is all about that unity, that becoming one. And there's a couple of other types of covenants that we can see in the Bible. There's name covenants, but they kind of come under some of the others. There's threshold covenants, which again come under some of the others. But those are the three main types. So what I want to do is to have a look through the covenants in the Bible and see how they fit together. And the very first covenant is the Adamic covenant, the covenant that God made with our first parents. And what did he say to our first parents? First of all, he gave them a commission. Fill the world, subdue the world, and rule over the world. And then he gave them a commandment. You can eat any tree, eat the fruit from any tree in the garden, and we get the impression that there was lots of different trees in the garden. There was plenty of variety for them to choose from. But you can't eat the fruit from that one particular tree. So this was actually a suzerainty agreement. God was stating it. This is what I'm going to do. This is what you're going to do. And he was appointing man as his vice regent here on earth. But there was terms, and the terms were pretty simple. You know, you've got this commission, fill the earth, subdue the earth, rule over the earth. And you've got this command, don't eat from that tree. Now, we always focus on the eating from that tree, which was the breaking of the command. But they had actually failed to carry out the commission before they broke the command. And the failure to carry out the commission was, in fact, the thing that led up to the command. Because if they had done what God said and subdued the world, which meant subdue every creature and every spirit in the world, then Satan wouldn't have been able to get into the snake and tempt them. They failed, first of all, to recognize their identity, that they were in the image of God. They were all that as close to God as it could be for a mortal person to be. They missed that, and they failed to carry out the commission to subdue the world and rule over it. Satan had fallen to the world. He'd taken possession of the snake. If they'd carried out their commission, they would never have got to the point of breaking the commandment. But that was a suzerainty treaty of God saying, I'm your king, and this is what you're going to do. We come forward to Noah. We know that Noah was commissioned to build the ark and reigned for 40 days and 40 nights, but that wasn't the whole thing. It was a year of flooding and the world being inundated. An interesting point. I saw something just in this last week. Scientists have apparently discovered that there is a deposit of water under the earth, which they say has got 3 times as much water as all the oceans on the earth. And it seems logical to me that is the water. People say, well, where'd the water come from and where'd the water go to in the flood? Well, there it is. But God had called Noah to do this and to save his family and some of the animals. But then he makes this covenant after the flood's over and Noah's got back on ground. But this time it's not a suzerainty treaty. If you read through that passage that Glenn read earlier, there's no conditions. God simply says, this is what I'm doing. It was a royal grant. And he says to them that increase and multiply, and the fear of you and the dread of you will be on all the animals. In other words, what I told you to do, what I told man to do back there, I'm not going to rely on you to do it now. I'm telling you it's going to happen. Isn't that great? God says, you blew it, but I've not blown it. I'm going to do that for you. And you may have noticed in that passage how many times he says, this is my covenant that I make with you. In other words, I'm pledging this. I'm standing on my character, on my reputation. I'm saying this. There is no question about it. This is what stands. I come forward again to Abraham. We know that God had promised Abraham that he would have a son, and that son would produce many, many children. He took him out one time and said, look at the stars, look at the sand of the sea. If you can count them, then you can count what your offspring will be. And this promise keeps getting repeated to Abraham. But at one point, God says to him, and Abraham questions it. God says, I am your shield and your very great reward. And Abram as he was then, almost immediately says, what will you give me? Like, I've just said, I'm your shield, I'm your reward, and you're asking, what will you give me? Excuse me, Abraham? But God then does an interesting thing. He gets Abraham to get the animals and cut them and put them aside as he would for making a blood covenant. But Abram doesn't walk through those parts. God puts Abram to sleep. And the word says that a smoking fire pot and a burning torch went through the parts. So what was this? We can only think that it was God the Father and God the Son making covenant together on behalf of Abraham. And remember, a blood covenant could only be made between equals. So God couldn't make a blood covenant with Abram. It had to be between father and son on behalf of Abram. And then God makes a royal grant covenant to Abram and says, I'm going to do this. And so Abram's promises didn't depend on Abram's obedience, didn't depend on anything that Abram did. And it's interesting as you read through the story of Abram, because we know that he's the father of faith. He's upheld in Hebrews as one of the great heroes of faith. Paul refers to him as our father in the faith. But when you read through his story, there are so many times when he was not expressing faith. There's so many times when he was doubting, so many times when he was questioning. How can this be? Look at me, I'm an old man. My wife's old. Can't happen. And even to the extent then of trying to help God along by accepting Sarah's offer of her maidservant as a surrogate mother, as it were. We read Abram's story and we think, this doesn't sound like a man of faith. But the thing is, God's promises, because it was a royal grant, were not dependent upon Abram's faith, were not dependent on Abram's obedience. And because it was a royal grant, that covenant still stands. God has never withdrawn it. Then we come forward to Moses. We know the story of Moses born in Egypt, thrown into the river because of Pharaoh's declaration, but thrown in a nice little safe basket. And I love that his mother obeyed the command but got around it at the same time. And grew up in Pharaoh's palace, but then sided with his own people and as a result had to flee into the wilderness. And at 80 years of age, he sees this burning bush. Burning bush was no surprise. Lots of bushes in that area spontaneously ignite. They're very oily bushes, and it's quite, apparently, I've never seen it, but apparently quite normal for these bushes to burst into flame. What was unusual was that it wasn't getting burnt up. It was still burning and there's still a bush there. And Abram goes, what's going on here? And so he goes over and checks it out. And God says, go back to Egypt and set my people free. I can't do that. I can't speak. Yeah, Moses. I love it that God worked with what Moses could offer him at the time. And so, he goes back to Egypt. He performs all these miracles at God's request till finally Pharaoh says, that's it, get out of here. And then they cross the Red Sea. The Israelites get across safely. The Egyptians get drowned. And then they come to Mount Sinai. And God institutes a covenant. And this is a suzerainty treaty covenant. It's instituted by God. It's saying, I am God, you are my people, this is what you are going to do as my people. And implies, I will protect you, I will provide for you, I will be God to you. But you have to do this, this, and this. And it's spelled out this law, what they call the law of Moses or the Torah. And, it's not just the 10 Commandments. They told me 613 laws in the Torah. And God expected his people to live by that law. The only problem was the law could point out what they were doing wrong. He could show them what God was like, because every part of the law reflected some part of God's character, but it couldn't enable them to do it. So that was a suzerainty treaty. And a suzerainty treaty was made with one people. It wasn't made with the whole world. It was made with the people of Israel. So the Mosaic covenant was just for the people of Israel. And as you read through the Old Testament, you see places where, the people of Israel were treated differently from the people of the nations round about. But then God made this promise through the prophet that I will bring a new covenant. I'll write my laws on their hearts. And for that, he needed a whole new scenario. Now we know that the word tells us that God had already planned it all before he ever created the world. The word says that Jesus is the Lamb slain from the foundation of the world. And that in itself amazes me, that God knew everything we were going to do. He knew how we were going to fail, but he already made provision. And so Jesus came, God the Son, left behind heaven. And that in itself blows my mind. And, our people here have heard me talk about it before, that the one who was infinite, the one who was all-powerful, the one who was all-knowing, the one who was worshipped by angels, came as a tiny baby, and not even to a king's palace, but to a stable. He became like us in every way except sin, and lived like us, and went to a cross on our behalf. And we know that there was a covenant made there at the cross. It talks about it. It talks about in the passage that Glenn read earlier. Jesus said, "This is my blood of the new covenant." But what I want you to understand is this was not only a new covenant, it wasn't just a reinvention of the Mosaic covenant. This was a covenant of an entirely different type. The Mosaic covenant was a suzerainty treaty. The new covenant was a blood covenant. And it was blood covenant, first of all, between the Father and Jesus, because a blood covenant has to be between equals. And so Father and Jesus entered this covenant on our behalf, that we would be forgiven, that we would be brought into his kingdom. But also, because Jesus had made himself like us in every way except sin, he was also able to enter into a blood covenant with us, because now we were equals. And so that covenant has everything that a blood covenant contained. And it was not just about, I'm your God, you're my people, do this, do this, do this. That's why it's so different from the old covenant. The blood covenant is, we are one. And that was Jesus' great high priestly prayer for us in John 17, that we might be not only one with each other, but one with him and with the Father. I think it's in Corinthians, I might be wrong in that, Paul says that he's talking about sexual immorality, and he says that who is with a prostitute becomes one body with her, but he who is united to the Lord becomes one spirit with him. And I think this is something that the church has missed big time, that the new covenant isn't just about doing what God says. It's about becoming one with him, being united with him. And in that union, everything that he has becomes ours. Everything that we have becomes his. So when God asks us for something, he's not asking for something that we shouldn't be giving. He's not asking for something that he doesn't have a right to, because when we accepted that covenant, we accepted both sides of the covenant. We accepted that everything he has is ours, and we're happy to do that. But we also have to have accepted that everything we have is his. we're brought into oneness with him. And so that's my emphasis this morning. So many people are trying to live under the Mosaic covenant, or they're trying to turn the new covenant into Mosaic covenant version 2. New covenant isn't the Mosaic covenant version 2. It's not only a new covenant, it's a covenant of a totally different nature. And in that covenant, we come into that place of unity with Christ, through which all that he is becomes available to us and through us to this world that needs him so, so much. Amen.